This is a story of how a secret spy entered the house of one of the most feared mafia bosses in the country and changed his life forever. Her name was Lina Raymond. She was not just a woman who cleaned floors. She was a highly educated, rich, and smart secret agent who spoke perfect English and owned her own businesses. But she had to pretend to be a simple maid who could barely speak good English to complete her mission. The man she was sent to spy on was Marco De Luca, the most powerful mafia boss in the city of Bella Vita. He lived in a giant white mansion on top of a hill. People were scared of him because he was known for making people disappear. He had money, cars, guards, and control. But behind his power was a man who didn't sleep well, didn't laugh much, and didn't trust anyone. Lina joined the mansion as a maid. She wore plain clothes, kept her hair tied up, and spoke slowly, so no one would suspect her real identity. "Yes, sir. I clean, sir," she would say, pretending not to understand big English words. Everyone believed she was just another poor woman looking for work. That was exactly what she wanted. Her mission was simple: get close to Marco, gather proof of his crimes, and report back to the secret agency. But as the days passed, she started to notice things that were not part of the reports. Marco was strict and feared, but he wasn't heartless. He gave money secretly to an orphanage every month. He never shouted at children or women. Sometimes she saw him sitting quietly at night, just staring at a picture of his mother. One night, while she was mopping the floor in the hallway, Marco came in. He looked tired. "Why are you still working this late?" he asked her. She looked down quickly. "I clean, sir," she replied in her fake accent. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "You're not like the other maids. You don't talk too much." Lina smiled lightly and said, "Talking too much no good, sir." Marco laughed a little, something he hadn't done in a long time. That small moment made him feel calm. As days turned into weeks, Marco began to notice Lina more. She worked quietly, never asked for anything, and didn't gossip like others. He began to trust her. Sometimes, when his men were gone, he would ask her small questions like, "Do you believe people can change?" She would shrug and say, "If heart want to change, maybe can." He would smile at her answers. She didn't know it yet, but she was already softening his heart. Then one afternoon, things changed. One of Marco's men betrayed him and stole a lot of money from his account. Marco lost his temper. He broke a glass table, shouted at everyone, and fired 3 of his men. Everyone ran out of the room, except Lina. She stayed still, her eyes calm. When the room was quiet again, she said softly, "Sir, maybe I help clean the mess?" He looked at her in surprise. "You're not afraid of me?" She shook her head slowly. "No, sir. Angry man still human." That was the moment Marco saw something different in her. No one had ever spoken to him like that. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about her. And that same night, Lina sat in her small room, thinking too. She was supposed to bring him down, but she was starting to feel sorry for him. Something was changing in both of them. Marco could not sleep that night. He kept thinking about Lina and the calm way she had spoken to him. No one had ever dared speak to him like that, not even his closest men. He poured himself a drink and sat in his office, staring at the city lights below. Something in her words made him feel less alone. The next morning, Lina went about her chores as usual. She cooked, cleaned, and served tea. She kept her head low, her accent rough, pretending to be a simple maid. But inside she was alert. She was watching, listening, and taking notes about everything in the mansion. Every meeting Marco had, every conversation, every phone call, she memorized it all. That day, Marco had a meeting with his top lieutenants. They were planning a big deal that could make or break their empire. Lina followed at a distance, pretending to tidy the hallways. She could hear everything. She learned about debts, betrayals, and hidden enemies. She also noticed Marco's frustration and stress. He was trying to keep control, but the cracks were showing. Later in the afternoon, Marco called Lina into the kitchen. "Bring me some coffee," he said. Lina obeyed. As she handed him the cup, she accidentally spilled a little. Marco frowned, but then he looked at her face. She looked nervous, but not scared. He saw honesty in her eyes. "You don't need to act scared," he said quietly. Lina simply nodded, keeping her secret. In the evening, Marco walked past the servants' quarters and paused. He saw Lina quietly folding the laundry. "You work too much," he said. Lina smiled faintly. "Work keep mind busy, sir." He looked at her again. He was curious about her calmness, her control, and her quiet confidence. Something about her felt different from everyone else in his world. Lina had started to notice Marco's habits too. She saw how he cared for his dog, how he checked that his employees were fed, and how he helped the neighbors quietly. He was a dangerous man, yes, but he had a heart, hidden beneath all the fear and power. She began to think that maybe she didn't just want to bring him down anymore. She wanted to see if he could change. That night, Lina sat in her small room, reviewing her notes. She had evidence of Marco's illegal activities, but she also saw opportunities to guide him in another way. She realized that if she wanted to complete her mission, she would have to get closer, not just as a maid, but as someone he could trust. Meanwhile, Marco sat in his office, thinking about her. He didn't know why, but her presence made the chaos of his life seem smaller, more manageable. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a life where he didn't have to fight constantly, where someone cared about him. Little did he know, Lina was already planning to use that trust to change everything, for him and for herself. The next morning, Marco's world started to fall apart. One of his trusted business partners betrayed him. A large shipment of money and goods had disappeared overnight. He called his men urgently. "Find out who did this. Now." His anger was louder than ever, but no one had answers. Panic began to spread among his closest allies. Lina watched quietly from the kitchen doorway. She kept her expression calm, pretending not to notice. Inside, she was analyzing everything. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Marco was at his weakest, and she needed to decide how to act. But something unexpected happened. She felt a small pang of concern for him. Despite his power and crimes, he was a human being in trouble. Marco shouted at his lieutenants, "You all failed me. How could this happen?" No one dared answer. They looked down at the floor, afraid of the storm in his eyes. Lina quietly approached with a tray of coffee. "Sir, maybe I help," she said softly, her fake accent on point. Marco turned sharply. He frowned. "What do you mean? How can you help?" I know ways to fix problem," Lina said. She spoke carefully, pretending she didn't know much. "Small steps. Slow. But work." Marco hesitated. No one had ever spoken to him like that. He was used to fear, threats, and orders. But her voice was calm, patient, and confident. He didn't understand why, but he trusted her instinctively. Over the next few hours, Lina guided him quietly. She suggested checking accounts carefully, tracing shipments, and keeping close watch on his employees. Marco followed her advice. Slowly, he started to regain some control. By the evening, he had located some of the missing assets and caught the betrayer. He looked at Lina, surprised. "You helped me?" he asked. Lina nodded, keeping her secret. That night, Marco could not sleep. He thought about how a simple maid, someone he barely noticed before, had saved him from losing everything. He remembered her words, her calmness, and her confidence. Something inside him shifted slightly. Maybe there was more to this woman than met the eye. Meanwhile, Lina sat in her room, thinking. She was supposed to spy on him, collect evidence, and report back. But now she was also thinking about how she could guide him to change, to use his power for something better. The more she watched him, the more she realized he had potential beyond fear and violence. Little did either of them know, this was only the beginning. Marco had survived the first real test of losing everything, and Lina was about to play a bigger role in his life. The coming days would reveal secrets, betrayals, and choices that neither of them could ignore. The next morning, Marco woke up to more bad news. A rival gang had taken control of one of his warehouses. The shipment he had just recovered was now at risk again. His empire was shaking, and he felt anger and fear rising in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Lina was in the kitchen, sweeping quietly. She had overheard the phone call between Marco and his lieutenants. She knew this was a critical moment. She approached him carefully. "Sir, maybe stop angry first," she said softly, pretending to speak broken English. Think clear. Then fix problem. Marco looked at her. Her calmness surprised him. Most people would have panicked or run. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. You really think a maid can help me solve this? He asked, more curious than angry. Lina nodded. Sometimes, people not who they look, she said simply. Marco stared at her. Something about her tone made him pause. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't begging. She was just thinking. Following her advice, Marco spent the day reviewing maps, shipments, and security logs. Lina stayed nearby, quietly reminding him of details he might have missed. By late afternoon, Marco discovered that one of his own men had betrayed him again. He clenched his fists in frustration. I trusted him, he shouted. Lina stepped closer. Sir, maybe problem not only man. Maybe system need fix, she said softly. Marco looked at her, realizing she was right. That evening, he called an emergency meeting with his top lieutenants. Lina suggested changes in management, security, and trust. Marco followed her guidance, making adjustments he had never considered before. Slowly, he began to regain control over parts of his empire. The first cracks of hope appeared in his eyes. After the meeting, Marco returned to his office. He poured himself a drink and stared at the city. For the first time in a long while, he felt a small sense of relief. He didn't understand it yet, but he was starting to rely on Lina's insight. She wasn't just a maid. She had a sharp mind he had never encountered before. That night, Lina sat in her room, reviewing everything she had observed that day. She knew Marco was vulnerable, but she also saw the good in him. He could change if guided carefully. And she realized that to truly help him, she would need to get even closer. She was no longer just a spy. She was becoming someone who could influence the fate of a mafia boss. Meanwhile, Marco couldn't stop thinking about her. He was confused. Why was a maid helping him? Why did he feel grateful? He didn't have answers yet, but he knew one thing. Lina was different from everyone else in his life, and that difference would soon change both of them forever. By the morning, Marco's empire was in full chaos. Another shipment was missing, and one of his warehouses had been seized by a rival gang. His lieutenants were scared and confused. Marco felt panic rising in his chest. For the first time, he realized that money, power, and fear could not protect him alone. Lina was quietly sweeping the hallway when Marco stormed past her. He paused and looked at her. Do you have any idea what to do now? He asked, his voice sharp. Lina tilted her head slightly. Yes, sir. Maybe stop try alone. Use plan. Careful, step by step, she said slowly. Her calmness again surprised him. He didn't understand why he trusted her advice more than his own men. All day, Lina helped him organize. She suggested securing the warehouses, checking which men were loyal, and communicating carefully with his allies. She reminded him to be patient and strategic. Marco followed her guidance, and slowly, small victories appeared. A shipment was recovered, and a betrayer was identified. Despite the small wins, Marco felt exhausted. He had never felt so vulnerable. Lina noticed his fatigue and suggested he rest. Even strong men need pause, sir, she said softly. He looked at her and realized how much he depended on her. He had trusted no one for years, but here was a maid guiding him calmly through the chaos. That evening, a rival gang tried to ambush one of his remaining warehouses. Marco panicked at first. He was about to send men into a dangerous fight when Lina stepped in. Wait, sir. Not rush. Think. Use safe move, she said. Marco hesitated, then followed her instructions. The rival gang was caught in a trap, and his men were safe. For the first time in days, Marco felt relief instead of fear. After the ambush, Marco called Lina into his office. You saved my men today, he said quietly. Lina smiled faintly. Sir, I just tell truth. Smart plan better than fight blind, she replied. Marco studied her. He still thought of her as a maid, but now he was starting to see that she had wisdom far beyond her role. Late that night, Lina sat in her small room, thinking about her mission. She had expected to simply spy on Marco and collect evidence, but now she felt something different. She cared about him, not just as a target, but as a man in need. She realized that helping him survive this collapse might also be a way to guide him to change. Meanwhile, Marco sat in his office, staring at the city lights. He thought about the maid who had saved him again and again. He didn't understand why he trusted her, why her calm voice made sense when no one else's did. Something in his mind and heart was shifting. Lina was no longer just a maid. She was someone who could change the path of his life, and maybe even his heart. By the next morning, Marco's empire was almost unrecognizable. One of his warehouses had been taken over completely. A trusted lieutenant had disappeared, and several key shipments were missing. Panic was spreading among his men. For the first time, Marco felt fear that he could not control. Lina was quietly working in the kitchen, but her mind was sharp. She knew this was the moment to guide him not just to survive, but to rethink everything he had built. When Marco stormed into the kitchen, she didn't flinch. "Sir, maybe slow down. Plan first," she said softly. Marco looked at her, frustrated but willing to listen. He spent the day with Lina's help, reviewing every detail. She reminded him which men could be trusted, which warehouses were safe, and which enemies could be trapped. Marco followed her advice carefully, learning to act strategically instead of reacting with anger. Slowly, he regained some control over the chaos, though much of his empire was gone. By evening, another crisis hit. A shipment of money was about to be seized by the rival gang. Marco felt panic rising. He was about to act rashly when Lina stepped forward. "Sir, wait. Follow plan," she said quietly. Her calmness steadied him. He listened, followed her instructions, and the shipment was secured without a single fight. That night, Marco called Lina into his office. How do you know all this?" he asked, still thinking of her as just a maid. Lina lowered her eyes. I think smart, sir. Watch careful. Make plan. That all," she said in broken English. Marco didn't believe it. Her words sounded too wise to be just a maid's. After Marco left the office, Lina sat quietly, thinking. She had been sent to spy on him, but she was beginning to feel something unexpected compassion. Marco was dangerous, yes, but she saw the human side beneath the power and fear. If she wanted, she could bring him down completely, but she wondered if she could instead help him survive and maybe change. Meanwhile, Marco could not stop thinking about Lina. Every move she suggested, every calm word, had saved him more than once. He began to realize she was more than she appeared. Her presence was steadying him when nothing else could. For the first time, he wondered who she really was. That night ended with a quiet tension in the mansion. Marco's empire was nearly destroyed, but thanks to Lina, he was still alive. Lina, meanwhile, sat in her room planning her next move. She knew that soon, she would have to reveal the truth to him, but not yet. For now, she would continue to guide him carefully, keeping both her mission and her growing feelings a secret. By morning, Marco's situation had worsened. His remaining warehouses were under threat. Some of his men had abandoned him, and his rivals were gaining power. He realized that his empire was close to collapsing. For the first time, he felt completely vulnerable. Lina moved quietly through the mansion, observing him. She noticed how tense he was, how tired his face looked, and how fear mixed with anger in his eyes. She approached him cautiously. "Sir, maybe not try fix all alone. Small steps," she said softly. Marco looked at her, frustrated but unable to ignore her calm presence. He spent the day following her guidance. She helped him organize his remaining men, track betrayals, and secure what was left of his business. Slowly, they regained some control. Marco began to realize that he could trust her judgment, even though she was just a maid in everyone else's eyes. Later that evening, Marco faced another betrayal. One of his closest lieutenants had secretly aligned with a rival gang. Marco was furious and ready to lash out. Lina stepped forward quietly. "Sir, maybe wait. Not act blind. Catch problem careful," she said. Marco hesitated, then followed her advice. They exposed the traitor without violence, saving what was left of his empire. That night, Marco finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He poured a drink and sat in his office, thinking about Lina. She had saved him more than once. Her calm words, careful plans, and quiet presence had kept him alive. He began to wonder who she really was, and how a simple maid could be so smart and capable. Meanwhile, Lina sat in her room, thinking too. She had been sent to spy on Marco, but she had grown attached to him in ways she hadn't expected. He was dangerous, yes, but beneath the power and fear, she saw a man who could change. She wondered if she could guide him toward a better life, and maybe even protect him from himself. Over the next few days, their partnership grew stronger. Marco began to rely on her more than anyone else. He valued her insight, even though he still saw her as a maid. Lina, on the other hand, was learning more about him, his habits, and his vulnerabilities. She knew that soon, she would have to make a decision about revealing her true identity. By the end of Hour 7, Marco had survived the week's crises, but his empire was still in ruins. Lina had become his most trusted advisor, though he didn't fully understand why. Both of them sensed that their lives were about to change dramatically. What neither knew was that the biggest surprises were still ahead. By the next morning, Marco's enemies were closing in. Rival gangs had taken over more of his territory, and his remaining men were restless. Fear was spreading among his closest allies. For the first time, Marco realized that money and power alone could not save him. Lina was quietly preparing breakfast when Marco stormed into the kitchen. "What now?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. Lina looked up calmly. "Sir, maybe not fight all at once. Plan careful. Step by step," she said in her broken accent. Marco paused. Her calmness was the opposite of everything else in his life, and for some reason, it made him think clearly. Throughout the day, Marco followed her guidance. She reminded him which men were loyal, which warehouses were still safe, and which rivals were overextending themselves. Slowly, with Lina's careful instructions, Marco managed to protect what remained of his empire. Small victories gave him hope, though most of his power was gone. Late in the afternoon, a rival gang tried to attack one of his remaining shipments. Marco panicked at first, ready to act with anger and force. Lina stepped forward. "Wait, sir, use plan. Think first," she said. He hesitated, then listened. Following her instructions, the attack was stopped without bloodshed. Marco was surprised. Her calmness had saved him again. That night, Marco finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He poured a drink and stared at the city. Lina's advice had kept him alive and kept some of his empire intact. He couldn't understand it, but he trusted her instincts more than anyone else's. She was not just a maid. She was someone who could think clearly in chaos. Meanwhile, Lina sat in her small room, thinking about the next steps. Marco was vulnerable, but he had potential. She realized that if she guided him carefully, he could survive and maybe change. She also felt something she hadn't expected, a growing connection to him. Over the next few days, Marco's reliance on Lina grew. He began to ask her questions and listen to her advice more than his lieutenants. Lina, on the other hand, was learning about his habits, fears, and strengths. She knew that soon she would have to reveal the truth about herself, but the time was not yet right. By the end of Hour 8, Marco had survived another day of chaos. His empire was nearly destroyed, but Lina's guidance had prevented complete collapse. Both of them sensed that something bigger was coming, a moment that could change their lives forever. By morning, Marco's empire had almost completely collapsed. Most of his warehouses had been seized by rivals, several loyal men had turned against him, and his financial accounts were nearly empty. For the first time, he felt truly powerless. Fear gripped him like never before. Lina quietly entered the office with a cup of coffee. "Sir, maybe not lose hope," she said softly, her broken accent hiding her intelligence. Marco looked at her, frustrated and exhausted. "Not lose hope?" he asked. "I've lost everything." Lina knelt slightly to appear smaller and said, "Maybe everything not gone. Can fix, step by step." He had no choice but to follow her guidance. Lina calmly helped him review every remaining asset, every loyal ally, and every weak point of his rivals. Slowly, with her instructions, Marco was able to recover a few key shipments and protect his last loyal men. It was not much, but it was something, and it gave him a small spark of hope. That afternoon, Marco's rival gangs tried to strike again. His men panicked, unsure of what to do. Lina quietly took charge. "Sir, you lead calm. We follow plan. No panic," she said. Marco followed her advice. They used strategy instead of anger, and the attack failed. Marco realized that her advice was saving his life. For the first time, he truly trusted her instincts. By evening, Marco finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He looked around his nearly empty office and thought about the maid who had guided him through every disaster. He realized something startling. Without her, he would have lost everything, maybe even his life. He began to see her as more than just a maid. Meanwhile, Lina sat quietly in her room, reviewing everything. Marco was a dangerous man, yes, but she saw the potential for change. She also realized that she was growing attached to him, more than she expected. She was no longer just a spy. She was someone who could influence the life of a man who had once seemed untouchable. That night, Marco called Lina to his office. You've saved me again." "Why?" he asked. Lina looked down, her heart beating fast. "Sir, I just help. Maybe you see new way. Life better," she said carefully, still hiding her true identity. Marco studied her quietly. Her calmness, her wisdom, her presence. It was unlike anyone he had ever known. The morning was quiet. Marco sat in his office, exhausted from the constant attacks and betrayals. His empire was nearly gone, but Lina had guided him through every disaster. He still saw her as a maid, but he felt a strange sense of trust and relief whenever she was near. Lina entered the office carrying a tray of coffee. She stopped, looked at him, and took a deep breath. "Sir, I think time come. You know truth," she said softly. Marco frowned. "Truth? What are you talking about?" he asked, confused. Lina slowly removed her apron. She stood tall and confident. Her simple maid clothes were gone. Underneath, she wore elegant, expensive clothes. Her hair was down, her face perfectly made up, and her eyes shone with intelligence. "I am not your maid," she said calmly. "I am Lina Raymond, secret agent, business owner, wealthy, educated. Everything you thought I am is not true." Marco froze. He couldn't believe his eyes. The woman he had trusted as a maid, who had guided him, saved him, and stayed calm in chaos, was not what she seemed. He stepped back. How?" he stammered. Why lie to me?" Lina walked closer. "I had to get close, sir. Your empire, you're meant dangerous. I needed to protect you and gather information. But I also saw you, the real you, and I knew you could survive and maybe change. That is why I stayed. That is why I helped." Marco sank into his chair. He looked at her, speechless. The calm, beautiful, intelligent woman before him had been the maid he thought was timid, quiet, and simple. All the advice, all the plans, all the guidance, it had been her all along. His mind raced, and slowly, he felt awe, respect, and something unfamiliar, admiration. Lina smiled softly. "I am still the same person who helped you survive, sir. But now, you can see me as who I really am. And maybe we can work together. Not as boss and maid, but as equals. Partners." Marco looked at her quietly, trying to process everything. The fear, anger, and chaos of the past weeks felt smaller. For the first time, he felt hope in a new way. That night, Marco and Lina sat together in the office, planning. Marco realized that he could trust her completely. He had lost almost everything, but the woman who had been his maid had just changed his life in seconds. Not with force, not with money, but with wisdom, courage, and vision. Marco knew something had shifted forever. This was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. The next morning, Marco felt different. He no longer felt the weight of fear and power alone. Lina sat beside him, calm and confident, guiding him step by step. For the first time, he felt that someone truly understood him and wanted to help him, not out of fear, but out of care. They began to rebuild what remained of his empire. Lina's intelligence and resources complemented Marco's experience and influence. She introduced strategies, legal businesses, and contacts that helped stabilize his wealth. Slowly, Marco regained control, but this time in a smarter, safer way. Marco watched her work and felt admiration growing. Lina was more than a secret agent. She was brilliant, strong, and wise. He realized he could trust her completely. For the first time in his life, he considered sharing his life and decisions with someone else, not as a boss giving orders, but as a partner. As days passed, their bond grew stronger. They shared ideas, plans, and small personal moments. Marco began to soften. He still had power, but he learned patience, strategy, and trust. He no longer ruled by fear alone. He ruled with guidance and collaboration. One evening, Marco looked at Lina and said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you for saving me, for changing my life." Lina smiled. "Sir, no need. Just stay better. Live smarter. Life still ahead. You survive, we succeed together." Marco nodded, realizing that her presence had not just saved his empire, but saved him as a person. In the weeks that followed, Marco's empire was rebuilt carefully. Some rival gangs were neutralized without violence, and his businesses were now stronger than before. Lina remained by his side, not as a maid, but as a partner, guiding him, advising him, and sometimes laughing at his stubborn moments. By the end, Marco had changed. He was still a powerful man, but now he was wiser, calmer, and more thoughtful. Lina had transformed his life, not just with strategy, but with her compassion and intelligence. And somewhere along the way, he realized that he had fallen for her, not the maid, not the spy, but the woman who had truly changed him. Together, Marco and Lina looked toward the future. They had survived betrayal, danger, and loss. They had rebuilt an empire and, more importantly, built trust, respect, and love. Marco knew that losing everything had been the moment that changed him, and Lina had been the reason his life began again.